She was just a secretary. Nobody important. Nobody dangerous. That was the last mistake they ever made about Evelyn Brooks. Because the night they broke into her apartment, beat her unconscious, and left her bleeding on the kitchen floor while her 6-year-old daughter sat beside her crying, they forgot one thing. They forgot she'd already hidden the evidence inside a child's storybook. And they forgot that little girl still had a phone. 1 call, 4 words. And the most feared man in Seoul would burn everything down to find the truth his mother died trying to tell him. If this story moves you, comment your city below. I want to see how far this has traveled. Now stay with me. This is only the beginning. The folder was misfiled. That was all it was. A single manila folder wedged between 2 binders on the bottom shelf of a cabinet that nobody opened anymore, tucked inside a storage room at the end of the hall where the overhead light had been flickering for 3 weeks, and nobody had bothered to replace the bulb. A misfiled folder. A clerical error. The kind of mundane mistake that happened in every office, every day, in every city on Earth. Except this one contained a dead woman's medical records. And the dead woman was Kang Hye-rin, and the man who had loved her more than anything in the world, more than his empire, more than his reputation, more than the fear other men carried in their chests when they heard his name, was sitting 40 feet away behind a closed door with his name on it in brushed gold letters. Evelyn Brooks stood in the storage room with the folder open in her hands and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with temperature. She had been a nurse once. 7 years of it. ER, ICU, oncology rotation, the whole brutal education. She knew how to read a medication log the way most people read a grocery receipt, automatic and exact, her eyes moving down the columns with the kind of practiced attention that didn't need to try. She had stood at bedsides at 3 a.m. with families who were falling apart and delivered information with steady hands because someone had to, and she had been good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good that takes years to build and one powerful person's lie to destroy. That was 4 years ago. Before the hospital board, before the suspension, before the licensing board hearing that lasted 6 days and ended with a decision that made her chest feel like something had been removed from it without anesthetic. Now she filed documents and answered phones and kept Kang Tae-jun's calendar and made sure his coffee was on his desk at 8:45 every morning. Black, no sugar, never late. Because late meant a look from him that could strip paint off a wall, and she had 3 months of rent to think about and a 6-year-old who needed new shoes. She looked down at the folder again. The medication log for Kang Hye-rin's final hospitalization covered 11 days. Evelyn's eyes moved through it the way they always did, involuntarily, professionally, and stopped at day 7. She went back, read it again. The diltiazem dosage on day 7 was 40 milligrams above the recorded prescription. On day 8, it was 60 above. The initials in the nurse's signature column were the same across all 11 days, but the handwriting changed on day 6. A small thing, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd spent years reading charts and knew how people's handwriting stayed consistent under pressure and changed when someone else was filling in the blanks. She flipped to the physician's notes. The notes on days 6 through 11 were crisp. Too crisp. Hospital notes were written under exhaustion, under pressure, in the margins of impossible schedules. They had a texture to them, abbreviations that didn't always match protocol, timestamps that didn't always line up perfectly because people were human and tired and working on 4 hours of sleep. These notes were clean. Uniform. The timestamps were exactly 90 minutes apart. Nobody wrote notes exactly 90 minutes apart for 11 straight days, unless they were writing them all at once and backdating. Evelyn's hands were steady. She had trained them to be steady. But her pulse was doing something she recognized from the old days, from the nights when she'd caught something the attending had missed and had to decide right then, in the space of a breath, whether to say it out loud. At the back of the folder, held in place by a single paper clip that had left a rust-colored indent in the paper, was an envelope, cream-colored, sealed, written on the front in careful, deliberate Korean characters. She couldn't read them, but she recognized a name. She had typed that name on enough correspondence to know its shape by sight, Kang Tae-jun. She stood there for 11 seconds. She counted them. Then she closed the folder, tucked it under her arm, walked back to her desk, sat down, and stared at her computer screen without seeing anything on it for a very long time. Outside the window, Seoul moved the way it always did. Indifferent and enormous. All glass towers and neon and 12 million people going somewhere at speed. The office was quiet. It was Thursday. Taejun had meetings from 9 to noon and then a lunch that his assistant director had confirmed twice that morning, which meant she had approximately 4 hours before anyone would notice what she was or wasn't doing. She thought about Zuri. Specifically, she thought about the way Zuri had looked that morning, sitting at the kitchen table in her school uniform, feet dangling off the chair because the chair was still too tall for her, eating rice with the focused concentration of someone performing surgery, her small face tipped down over the bowl. 6 years old, black, small, impossibly serious in the mornings, and impossibly loud by afternoon. Evelyn had brought her home from a neonatal unit 3 years ago when Zuri was 3, a child without family and with 2 social workers who had already started talking in the particular careful language that meant they were running out of options. Evelyn had not planned it. She had not been in a position, financially or professionally, or in any other way that a reasonable person would point to do it. She had done it anyway because the little girl had grabbed her finger and held on, and that had been the end of the discussion as far as Evelyn was concerned. 3 months of rent. New shoes. The electric bill that she had been paying in partial installments since February. She opened the folder again. She went through it a second time more slowly. She wasn't looking for confirmation. She already had that. She was looking for the shape of it, the architecture of what had been done and when. What she found, over 40 minutes of careful reading, was this. Someone had systematically altered Kang Hye-rin's treatment protocol over the last 5 days of her life. The original prescription, which appeared in a handwritten note on day 1 that matched the texture of genuine fatigue-written clinical notation, called for a dosage that would have stabilized her cardiac condition. What she actually received was a graduated escalation that would have looked, to anyone not paying very close attention, like a natural deterioration. Heart failure. Elderly woman. Tragic but not suspicious. Except the original note was still there. It hadn't been removed. Only overwritten, with different ink on a separate line, as if someone had been in a hurry or hadn't cared or had trusted that nobody who mattered would ever open this particular cabinet in this particular storage room. Evelyn sat back in her chair. She thought about what she was holding. She thought about who she was holding it for, or rather, 40 feet away behind a closed door. She thought about what kind of man Kang Tae-jun was. She had worked for him for 14 months, and she understood him the way you understood the weather in a city you'd lived in long enough. Not personally, not warmly, but accurately. He was not a man who forgave mistakes. He was not a man who asked questions twice. He had a stillness about him when he was angry that was more frightening than shouting would have been, a quality of absolute zero that came off him like cold off a window in winter. And she had seen what happened to people who disappointed him, and it was not something she spent time thinking about after the fact. She thought about all of this. And then she thought about the medication log. And then she thought, it doesn't matter. She went to the copy machine. It took her 12 minutes. She worked carefully, 1 page at a time, keeping the originals in order. When she was finished, she had a complete set of copies, and the originals returned to the folder exactly as she had found them. She put the copies inside a FedEx envelope she took from the supply closet, sealed it, and wrote her home address on the outside in her own handwriting. She did not seal the envelope with the letter inside. The letter she left alone, sealed, the name on the front untouched, because that was not hers to open. She slid the sealed envelope into the bottom of her tote bag under a library book and a water bottle in Zuri's spare sweater. Then she went back to her desk, pulled up Taejun's afternoon schedule, and began confirming his 3 o'clock. She did not know that there was a camera in the storage room. She did not know it because it had been installed 6 weeks ago and was not part of the building's official security system. She did not know who had installed it. She did not know that the footage had been live monitored since the day it went in. She did not know that by 8 o'clock that evening, Serena Vaughn would have watched the 40-minute recording 3 times. Serena Vaughn was not a woman who panicked. She considered panic a form of poverty, a resource failure, an admission that you had not prepared enough, thought far enough ahead, built the right walls around the right things. She had been preparing since she was 22 years old. She had been thinking ahead since before most people in her circles understood that there was anything to think ahead about. She had built walls that nobody could see because the best walls were invisible, And the best weapons were the ones people never recognized as weapons until they were already inside them. She watched the recording a fourth time. On the screen, Evelyn Brooks stood at the copy machine with the stillness of someone who had already made a decision and was simply executing it. No hesitation, no looking over her shoulder. The kind of calm that Serena, who considered herself an expert in reading people, found genuinely unnerving because it meant the woman wasn't scared. And people who weren't scared were unpredictable. She picked up her phone and called Adrian. He answered on the second ring, which was correct. He always answered on the second ring. She had trained him out of answering on the first. "There's a problem," she said. "I heard." His voice had that careful flatness he used when he was worried but didn't want her to know how worried. "How much of it did she copy?" "All of it." A pause. "The letter." "Still sealed. She left it." Serena stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her apartment and watched the lights of the Han River district burning against the dark. Which tells us something. What does it tell us? That she's not stupid. She knows what the letter says is for him and not for her. She's protecting the evidence, not trying to use it. She turned away from the window, which means she's going to try to get it to him. Then we move tonight. Tonight, Serena agreed. The copies, the originals, all of it. And Adrian. She let the pause do the work. She has a child. I don't want this complicated. Understood. She hung up and looked at the screen again. Evelyn Brooks at the copy machine. Patient, methodical, completely unaware. Serena felt something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, and was ultimately neither, because what she felt about other people had always been secondary to what she felt about the plan. The plan was everything. The plan was 7 years old. The plan had survived things that would have broken anyone without her particular capacity for the long view. The early days when Tae-jun had kept her at arm's length, the months of careful positioning, the 2 years it had taken to place Adrian where she needed him, the single terrible miscalculation with Hye-rin that had required the solution she still did not think about directly, only obliquely. The way you looked at something bright with your peripheral vision because looking straight at it damaged your eyes. The plan was almost done. The wedding was 11 days away. She was not going to let a misfiled folder and a disgraced nurse destroy it. Evelyn left the office at 6:17. She took the elevator to the underground garage, walked to the third row, where her car, a 10-year-old Hyundai with a crack across the dashboard that she'd been meaning to get fixed for 8 months, sat under a flickering fluorescent light. She put Zuri's sweater on the passenger seat, her tote bag on the floor, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She thought about driving directly to a police station. She thought about this for a real and genuine 30 seconds, turning it over, weighing it. Then she thought about what had happened the last time she'd taken documented evidence of institutional wrongdoing to official authorities. The licensing board, the hospital review committee, the 2 attorneys she'd paid to look at her case before running out of money. And she let that thought do what it did and put the police station aside. She thought about driving to the building and going back upstairs and putting the folder on Tae-jun's desk. She thought about what would happen next if she did that. His face, the questions, the certainty she would see in him when he had the whole picture, and the certainty she had already learned to read in him when he decided something, which was the same certainty she'd seen in him the morning he'd dismissed his entire legal team over a contract dispute and rebuilt it from scratch in 6 days. He would act. He would act fast, and he would act without mercy toward whoever deserved it. And that was... She stopped herself from finishing the sentence because finishing it meant acknowledging something about Tae-jun that she had been carefully not acknowledging for 14 months. She drove home. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Mapogu that had functional plumbing and not much else going for it. The elevator was broken, which it was roughly half the time, so she walked up. On the 2nd floor landing, Mrs. Choi from 2B was bringing groceries in, and they exchanged the particular nod of people who had been neighbors long enough to be past the stage of pretending to have more time for conversation than they did. Inside, the apartment smelled like the soup she'd put on before leaving that morning. Doenjang jigae, Zuri's Thursday request, a recipe she'd learned from a YouTube video 2 years ago and had been refining ever since. Zuri was on the couch with her shoes still on, which was a rule violation, her backpack open and dumped sideways on the cushion beside her, watching something on the tablet. "Shoes," Evelyn said. Zuri looked up, looked down at her feet. looked back up with an expression that managed to convey both awareness of the violation and the philosophical position that the violation was minor. She took the shoes off without argument, which was how Evelyn knew she wanted something. How was school? Okay. A pause. Ms. Park gave us a project. What kind of project? About families. Another pause. Loaded. She said we could do any kind of family. Then do our kind, Evelyn said, and went to check the soup. The kitchen was small. Everything in the apartment was small, but she had organized it with the same precision she brought to everything, every surface with a purpose, everything in its place. She lifted the lid on the soup, adjusted the heat, and stood there for a moment with the steam rising around her face. She needed to decide what to do with what was in her tote bag. She could not keep it at the office. Too risky, and besides, the originals were already back in place. She could not keep it at home indefinitely, because if whoever had created those falsified records realized they'd been copied, home was the first place they'd look. She needed to get the copies to Tae-jun quickly and cleanly, in a way that didn't put her in the position of walking into his office with an accusation about his dead mother and his fiancé with nothing to back her up except her own word, which, given her professional history, was not the asset it once had been. She was still working through the logistics when Zuri appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mommy. Is Mr. Kang nice? Evelyn turned to look at her. Zuri had her serious face on, the one that meant the question had been sitting in her for a while and she'd been waiting for the right opening. Why are you asking about Mr. Kang? Because you work for him, and sometimes when you come home you have your thinking face. I have a thinking face. Yeah, it goes like this. Zuri pulled her eyebrows together and looked at a point slightly to the left of Evelyn's head with an expression of concentrated gravity that was, Evelyn had to admit, fairly accurate. I'll take that under advisement, Evelyn said. Go wash your hands. Soup's almost ready. She watched Zuri disappear back down the hall and turned back to the stove and thought, I need to do this right. She needed to do it right because Zuri was in this apartment and Zuri's shoes were on the couch 3 minutes ago and Zuri had a family project due and Zuri needed new shoes and 3 months of rent had to come from somewhere. And all of that meant that Evelyn could not afford to make a mistake. She could not afford to make a mistake that would mean she wasn't here tomorrow morning to check that the shoes were off. She went to her room after dinner and put the copied files, minus the sealed letter, which she left in its envelope, inside Zuri's storybook. The book was a large format hardcover, the kind with thick pages and bright illustrations, the story of a small brown bear navigating the particular social catastrophes of kindergarten. There was a hollow in the back cover where a CD had once been housed. The CD was long gone, and the cavity was just deep enough. She pressed the papers in, tested the cover, put the book back on Zuri's nightstand where it always lived. Then she sat on the edge of Zuri's bed while Zuri brushed her teeth in the bathroom and thought about what she'd do in the morning. She was still thinking about it when she heard the sound. It was not a loud sound. It was, in fact, a very quiet sound, a quality of silence in the hallway that was slightly different from the ordinary silence of a building settling at night, a texture that her ER training registered in some prehistoric part of her nervous system before her conscious mind caught up. She stood up. The apartment door came open hard. Not locked. She had locked it. She was certain she had locked it, but the lock had not held, and she would think about that later. She would think about everything later. And there were 2 of them, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and knew exactly how much time they had. She screamed. She screamed as loud as she could manage in the 3/4 of a second before the first one reached her, because she needed Zuri to hear it, needed Zuri to know this was not normal sounds, needed Zuri to do the thing they had practiced. Not fire drill, not the thing you say, but the real thing. The thing she had told her daughter quietly one evening 6 months ago when she'd begun to understand, in a general way, that the world she moved through was not without edges. You go to your room, you lock your door, you get under the bed, and you do not come out until I come and knock 3 times. 3 times. You understand? She heard the door of Zuri's room close. She did not hear the lock. She hoped. She did not have time to do anything more about hoping because the first man hit her and the world tipped sideways and she hit the wall and went down and the linoleum was very cold against her face and she thought, the soup. I left the soup on. The second man was already in the kitchen. She could hear him going through things, drawers, cabinets, the sound of her organized life being pulled apart. She tried to get up. The first man put a foot on her back, not hard enough to break anything. A statement. She stayed down. Where is it? She said nothing. The folder, the copies, where? The stove. The soup was still on, and it would burn, and the smoke detector would go off. And Mrs. Choi downstairs had called the fire department once before for a false alarm, and had complained about it loudly for a week, which meant she would call again, which meant someone would come, which meant, last time, the man said. She thought about Zuri. She thought about the storybook on the nightstand. She thought about the copy machine and the 12 minutes and the 40-minute recording she did not know existed, and all the decisions that had produced this particular floor under her face, and this particular boot on her back, and this particular cold. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. He hit her twice more. Methodical. Not rage, technique. She went somewhere quiet and gray for a while, and when she came back, the apartment was destroyed around her. And she was alone, and she could smell smoke from the kitchen, and everything hurt in the particular diffuse way that meant the real pain hadn't organized itself yet, and would arrive in stages. She tried to call out to Zuri. Nothing came out. She tried again. She could not get up. The realization arrived without drama. Her body had simply stopped cooperating, had drawn a line somewhere in the region of her midsection, the accumulated damage registering all at once. And she was on the floor and the soup was burning and she could not get up. She thought about the phone. Her phone was somewhere in the wreckage. She turned her head and it sent white light across her vision, and she waited for it to pass and turned again and saw the edge of it, under the overturned kitchen chair 3 feet away. She got one arm under herself. She moved an inch. 2. The phone was cracked across the front and she thought, please, not a prayer, a demand, please work. It worked. She got to her contacts. Her hands were shaking now. Shock coming in, her body finally giving her the bill. And she scrolled and she got to the K's and she looked at the name there and thought about every reason not to call it, and then looked at the burning smell from the kitchen and the destroyed apartment around her and pressed the number. It rang. She waited. She heard a click. She thought she heard breathing. She tried to say something and what came out was not words, and she thought, Zuri. She thought, Zuri has the phone in her room. She always has the phone in her room because Evelyn lets her play games on it before bed. She always has it. She tried to speak again and couldn't. And from somewhere down the hall, muffled through a locked door, she heard her daughter's voice. Small, frightened, but steady in the way that some children were steady when the world went wrong because they had already learned that being afraid and being functional were not mutually exclusive. She heard Zuri's door open. She heard small feet in the hallway. And she thought, no, baby, go back. But nothing came out. She looked at the phone in her hand and realized, Tae-jun. She had called Tae-jun's number, and the line was still open. She tried one last time to speak, and what came out barely, almost nothing, was Zuri up, and then Zuri was there kneeling on the floor beside her, one small hand pressed flat against Evelyn's shoulder, and Evelyn watched her daughter's face do something she had never wanted to see it do. That particular collapse, that 5-second war between falling apart and holding on. And then Zuri picked up the phone from the floor where it had slipped, and the line was still open, and Zuri put it to her ear, and Evelyn watched her daughter's mouth open, and Evelyn heard 4 words come out of it in a voice that was barely above a whisper. And those 4 words were the most precise and devastating thing Evelyn had ever produced in her life, because she had not produced them. Zuri had. Mommy can't get up. The line was quiet for 2 seconds. Then a voice came through the phone, a voice Evelyn knew very well, a voice she had been careful to maintain exactly the right professional distance from for 14 months. And the voice was not calm, and it was not still, and it was nothing like what she had ever heard from the man who owned it. What is your address? And Evelyn, on the floor of her destroyed kitchen, with her daughter's hand on her shoulder and the soup burning on the stove, thought, there it is. There is the point of no return. She had already passed it. She had passed it 12 minutes into a copy job in a storage room with a flickering light, and she was only now understanding that. Tell him, she managed. Barely. To Zuri. And Zuri told him. The address Zuri gave him was in Mapogu. Tae-jun already had his jacket. He didn't remember picking it up. He was standing in the middle of his office with his phone in one hand and his jacket in the other, and the line had gone quiet again. Not dead, just quiet. The small ambient sound of an apartment that had been turned inside out still coming through faintly. And he stood there for exactly 3 seconds doing the thing he always did when something arrived that he hadn't planned for, which was locate the center of it and move toward it at speed. He called Shin. Hyun-soo Shin was his security chief and had been for 6 years and answered the way he always answered after hours. Alert, no greeting, nothing wasted. Mapo-gu. Taejun gave him the address. Now. What are we walking into? I don't know yet. A pause that lasted less than a second. 10 minutes. Taejun was already in the elevator. He did not think about what he was doing in the way that would have required justification. He did not ask himself why a phone call from his secretary's apartment, from a child's voice, barely above a whisper, saying 4 words, had produced in him the particular quality of cold urgency that he associated with threats to things that mattered. He did not examine it. He moved toward the parking garage the way he moved toward everything that required his attention, which was without hesitation and without the luxury of wondering whether he should. What he thought about, in the elevator, was the voice, the child's voice. He had not known there was a child. 14 months, and he had not known. Or rather, he had known in the way you knew things that existed outside the frame of what you were paying attention to. Evelyn Brooks, secretary, efficient, quiet, never late, never personal. A quality of self-containment about her that he had registered as professional and had not looked further into, because he did not look further into things about people unless he had reason to. 4 words. Mommy can't get up. He pressed the parking level button harder than necessary. Did. Shin was there in 9 minutes. Black SUV, engine running, pulled up to the building exit with the particular patience of a man who had learned that waiting was a form of action. Taejun got in. Shin pulled out without being told. Camera footage from the building? Taejun said. Already requested. Building management will push it through or I'll go get it myself. 2 of them, I think, from the sound. Shin glanced at him sideways. You kept the line open. Until the child stopped talking. Another sideways look. Shin was 41, former military. A man who wore his history in the set of his jaw and the particular way he occupied space, as if he had made a permanent decision about how much of it he was entitled to. He had worked for Taejun long enough to read him with the accuracy of a second language, and what he was reading now he kept to himself. The woman. Is she... I don't know. A pause. The girl said she couldn't get up. Shin said nothing after that. The drive to Mapo-gu took 11 minutes. Taejun spent most of it staring out the window at the night traffic and thinking about the kind of person who sent men to a woman's apartment while her child was inside. He was not a man who surprised easily. He had built an empire on the willingness to do things that other men found unthinkable, and he understood the architecture of threat and violence with the fluency of long practice. But there was a particular category of action that even inside his world was understood as a line, and the people who crossed it were understood to have made a statement about themselves that could not be walked back. He thought about who in his orbit would make that statement. He thought about it precisely and without the interference of emotion, the way he thought about all tactical problems, and arrived at a short list. He did not share it with Shin. Not yet. The building was a 4-story walk-up, with a broken elevator and fluorescent lighting in the stairwell that buzzed on the second-floor landing. He registered these things the way he registered everything: automatic, filed, discarded as irrelevant to the immediate. The door to apartment 4C was not fully closed. Someone had forced the lock and the frame had splintered where the bolt had been seated. He pushed it open. The smell reached him before anything else. Burnt fermented soybean, a pot on the stove that had scorched dry, the gas still on, the smell sour and acrid, and threaded underneath it something copper that he recognized and did not name. He moved through the doorway, and the apartment came into view. It had been gone through the way professional people went through things. Not ransacked in the theatrical sense. Not furniture overturned for drama, but opened, every drawer pulled, every cabinet cleared. The bookshelf along the wall had been swept, and the books were on the floor in a pile that was almost organized, as if whoever had done it had been looking for something specific among them and had set each one down after checking it rather than throwing them aside. The kitchen table was on its side, One chair was broken at the leg, not thrown, broken, which meant weight had come down on it at an angle, which meant someone had gone down. And there, on the kitchen floor beside the overturned chair, was Evelyn Brooks. Taejun had seen people in bad shape before. It was not something he allowed to operate on him in the moment. Reaction was expensive, and he had learned young to defer it, to pay the bill later in private, where it couldn't cost him anything tactical. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and crouched down and put 2 fingers to her neck and found the pulse. Weak, but organized. Present. She was conscious. Barely. Her eyes opened when he touched her. Just part way, and they didn't quite focus, but they opened and she made a sound that was not words, and he said, quietly, with a precision he kept in his voice through deliberate effort, "Don't move." From the hallway, a sound. He turned. Zuri was standing in the doorway to the hall, still in her school uniform from that morning, her backpack still on one shoulder, as if she had put it on to do something and then forgotten to put it down. She was holding a book, a large format hardcover with a cartoon bear on the cover, pressed against her chest with both arms, and she was looking at him with the particular expression of a child who had used up all available fear and come out the other side into something harder. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at her mother, then she looked back at him. "Are you Mr. Kang?" she said. "Yes." "Mommy said if you called." She stopped, looked at her mother again. "She said you would come." Something moved in his chest. He kept his face even. "When did she say that?" "After she came home today." She was thinking for a long time. Zuri looked down at the book. "She said if something happened, she said to give you this." She crossed the kitchen, 6 years old, stepping over the broken chair leg, around the spilled contents of a drawer, navigating the wreckage of her home with the steady feet of someone who had already decided the wreckage was not going to stop her, and held the book out to him. He took it. Shin was in the doorway behind him now. Taejun heard him take in the apartment in a single breath and begin to move, checking rooms, the systematic sweep of a man who needed to confirm the threat was gone before he could think about anything else. Taejun did not open the book. Not yet. He set it down and looked at Zuri and said, "Is there anyone we should call? Family? A neighbor?" She shook her head. "It's just us." "Okay." He looked at Shin coming back from the bedroom. Shin gave a short nod. Clear. And Taejun said, "Call Dr. Yoon. Private line, tell him we're coming. Hospital? No hospital." Shin looked at him. "Taejun, you heard me." A beat. Then Shin had his phone out. Taejun turned off the gas on the stove. He did it without thinking, the same reflex that had made him register the smell when he came in, and for some reason this small domestic action, reaching past the scorched pot, turning the knob, the hiss of the flame going out, produced a sensation in his sternum that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to locate. He turned back to Zuri. "I need you to get your shoes and your jacket," he said. "Anything you need for tonight. Can you do that?" She looked at him with those flat, already old eyes. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." "Is Mommy going?" "Yes." She considered this. Then she went to get her shoes. Dr. Yoon's assessment, delivered in the private receiving area of a clinic that appeared on no public registry, was systematic and unsentimental. 3 bruised ribs, a moderate concussion, soft tissue damage to her left shoulder, and a laceration above her right ear that had bled considerably but stopped on its own. Nothing requiring surgery. Nothing immediately life-threatening. She would need monitoring for the next 24 hours given the concussion, and she needed rest. And she needed to not be in an apartment with a broken lock in Mapo-gu. Taejun listened to all of this and said, "Will she be able to speak tonight?" Dr. Yoon looked at him. "She shouldn't be." "In the morning, then." "Taejun." Yoon had known him for 11 years and was one of approximately 4 people in the world who used his name without a title. "What happened to her?" "That's what I'm going to find out." He left Yoon with Evelyn and went to the waiting area, where Zuri had been installed on a couch, with a blanket that one of Yoon's assistants had found, the storybook still in her lap, her shoes off. She was not asleep. She was looking at the wall. He sat down in the chair across from her. She looked at him. "Is she going to be okay?" "Yes." "You sound sure." I am. Zuri pulled the blanket tighter. The men who came, she said. They were looking for something. What did they say? They kept asking Mommy where it was. A folder. She looked down at the book. She didn't tell them. She looked up again. She put something in here. In the back. She held the book out. She put it there before they came. I watched her. He took the book, opened the back cover, found the cavity and the papers inside it. He lifted them out and looked at the first page and sat very still for a moment and then turned to the next one. Medication logs, clinical notations. A physician's signature he knew. He'd seen it before. On the discharge summary he had been given the day his mother died. A document he had read once and filed and not returned to because he had been 29 and had lost the center of everything, and the paperwork had been the least of what he was dealing with. He turned pages. He was not a medical person. He did not have Evelyn Brooks' trained eye or 14 years of clinical pattern recognition. But he was a man who had spent his adult life reading documents for the thing they were not saying, for the negative space, for the version of events that lived between the lines, and what lived between these lines was not ambiguous. The escalation in the dosage columns, the perfect inhuman regularity of the physician's notes, the handwriting change on day 6 that she had circled in pencil. She had annotated the copies, he realized. She had marked every inconsistency before she filed them away in the back of a child's book. She had done it with the systematic care of someone who knew she was building a case and might not be the one to present it. He reached the last page. Behind it, still in its envelope, sealed, his name on the front in his mother's handwriting. He looked at it for a long time. Zuri was watching him. Mommy said that one's yours, she said. I know. She didn't open it. I know. He held the envelope. He thought about his mother's hands, the specific image of her hands, which he had memorized when he was a child. Because she had expressive hands, hands that said things her face didn't, and she had a way of pressing them flat on a table when she was being serious about something that meant pay attention. This is the real thing. He thought about 11 days in a hospital, and a discharge summary, and a funeral, and 3 years of making himself not look too closely at any of it, because looking closely at things you couldn't change was a form of punishment he had decided he wasn't willing to pay. He had been wrong about what could be changed. He opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages in his mother's handwriting, small and dense, and he read it twice. The first time he read it the way he read anything, for the factual content, the sequence of events, the names. The second time he read it for the weight of it, for the fact that she had written it, that she had sat somewhere with paper and a pen knowing what she knew and had written it for him, specifically because she had understood at the end that she would not be able to say it out loud. He folded it carefully and put it in his inside jacket pocket against his chest. He sat for a moment with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the floor and did not move. Zuri, across from him, said nothing. She seemed to understand, with the uncanny accuracy that some children had about the emotional weather of adults, that this was not a moment for speech. She just sat with her book and her blanket and waited. After a while, Taijun looked up. Shin was in the doorway. He had the look he got when he had information, a particular quality of controlled tension, shoulders slightly forward, chin slightly down. The security footage from the building, he said, and something else. Tell me. Shin came in and sat down and put his phone on the table between them. On the screen was a still image from a security camera. The exterior of the building, time-stamped at 7:42 p.m., showing 2 men Taejun didn't recognize entering the main door. He noted their build, their gait, the angle of their approach. "The something else," Taejun said. Shin took the phone back and pulled up a second image. Taejun looked at it. It was footage from a camera he did not recognize, not the building system, different resolution, different angle, showing the interior of the storage room at his own office, showing Evelyn Brooks at the copy machine, working methodically through a folder, 1 page at a time. He looked at the timestamp, 2:17 p.m., today. "This was sent to my phone," Shin said carefully, 40 minutes ago, from an anonymous number. Taejun said nothing. "The framing is clear," Shin said. "Whoever sent it wants you to see a thief, someone going through your mother's private files. I see a woman making copies at 2:17 who was beaten unconscious by 8 p.m. He looked up from the phone. "Who sent it?" I'm working on the number. Work faster. He stood. And Shin. He held Shin's eyes for a moment. This footage goes nowhere. You saw nothing. The phone it came to. Dead. New one tonight. Shin looked at him. Something passed through his expression. Not surprise, because Shin did not surprise easily, but a quality of recalibration, a man updating a calculation in real time. You know who sent it? I know who benefits from me seeing it. Shin let the silence sit for 2 seconds. The wedding is in 11 days. I know when the wedding is. Another beat. What do you want me to do? Taejun picked up the storybook from the table and looked at the cartoon bear on the cover. The big soft eyes, the expression of cheerful bewilderment. He thought about a woman annotating copied medical records in pencil and hiding them in a child's book. He thought about 4 words from a 6-year-old on an open line. He thought about his mother's hands pressed flat on a table. Find out who those 2 men are, he said, and find out who gave the order. He set the book down. Don't touch anyone yet. I want the full picture first. And the woman? He looked toward the hallway where the clinic room was. She stays, both of them, until she can talk. Shin nodded and stood, and his phone was already in his hand. At the doorway, he paused. If whoever sent that footage is watching, they'll think it worked, Taejun said. Let them think that. Shin left. Taejun sat back down. Zuri had fallen asleep, finally, sideways on the couch, the blanket pulled up to her chin, the storybook on the cushion beside her where her hands had been holding it when she went under. He looked at the child's face in sleep, the way the tension had left it, the way 6 years old looked like 6 years old again when it wasn't working so hard to be older. He thought about what his mother's letter had said, specifically the last paragraph, specifically the last 3 sentences, which he had read twice and which now sat in him like something physical, like a stone in still water, radiating cold in all directions. I never told you because I wanted you to choose her freely. But I watched her, Taejun. She is capable of anything. He put his hand flat on the table. He looked at it. He thought about all the decisions that had led to this particular table, this particular room, a sleeping child and a woman with 3 bruised ribs, and his mother's letter pressed against his chest. Then he thought about Serena Vaughn asleep in her apartment 11 days before their wedding, and what she would feel in the morning when she received confirmation that the copies had been recovered and the woman had been handled, and how completely and precisely wrong she was going to be. He was not going to fire Evelyn Brooks. He was not going to distance himself from what she had found. He was going to do the thing he was best at in the world, the thing that had built an empire from nothing and kept it standing through every attempt to take it apart. He was going to be absolutely, perfectly still and let the enemy believe they had already won, right up until the moment they understood they had never been further from it. 11 days. He had 11 days and a dead woman's letter and a set of annotated medical records and a secretary who had taken a beating rather than give up the evidence. He had worked with less. He reached into his jacket and took out his mother's letter and read it one more time in the quiet of the clinic waiting room while a 6-year-old slept across from him. And when he finished, he folded it again and held it in both hands and sat very still. And the stillness was not peace. It was the particular stillness of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of what was done to someone he loved and has made. Somewhere below the level of conscious decision, a choice that cannot be unmade. Outside, Seoul continued its indifferent machinery. 11 days. The clock had already started. Evelyn woke up knowing exactly where she was. Not because the room was familiar. It wasn't white walls and the particular antiseptic quiet of a private medical facility. A window with the blinds half drawn, letting in the gray early light of a Seoul morning. But because her body told her. The ribs told her. The shoulder told her. The place above her right ear where the laceration had been closed told her in a language that was very specific and left no room for confusion about the sequence of events that had produced it. She lay still for a moment and took inventory the way she'd been trained to, working through the damage systematically, assigning severity, estimating recovery timeline. 3 ribs. Concussion. Manageable. She'd seen worse, she'd had worse. The shoulder was the problem. She could feel the soft tissue had been wrenched and would take weeks to settle back into something functional. Her hands worked. Her feet worked. The headache was significant but organized. Sitting behind her eyes with the predictable pressure of a moderate concussive event rather than the diffuse wrongness of something more serious. She was going to be fine. She turned her head slowly toward the other side of the room. Zuri was asleep in a chair that had been pulled close to the bed, her legs tucked up under her, the storybook on the floor where it had slipped from her hands. Someone had put a blanket over her. The blanket was cream-colored and looked expensive and was not the kind of thing that came from a municipal clinic supply closet. Evelyn looked at her daughter's face for a long moment. Then she sat up. It took 3 attempts and produced a level of pain that she breathed through deliberately, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd taught patients to do it, the way she'd never expected to need the lesson herself. She got upright. She got her feet on the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the room to stop moving, and when it did, she looked at the door. It opened before she reached it. Taejun was on the other side. He looked like he hadn't slept. She had seen him in every professional configuration over 14 months, composed, cold, furious in the particular quiet way that was worse than fury. But she had not seen this, which was the version of him that existed before the composure came on, the version that lived in the hours before the armor was assembled. He was still in yesterday's clothes. There were shadows under his eyes that were not just exhaustion. He looked at her standing in the doorway with her hand on the frame for balance, and something moved across his face that he shut down almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. "You should be in bed," he said. "I've been horizontal for—" She checked the window light. 12 hours. I'm done being horizontal." She looked at him. "You read the records?" "Yes." "And the letter?" A pause. "Yes." She studied his face, the flatness of it, the careful control. She had spent 14 months learning to read the weather of this man from the small signals, the set of his jaw, the quality of his silence, the way he occupied a doorway. And what she read now was not anger, not exactly. Anger was something he wore. This was something underneath the wearing, something that had been there for a long time before she put a name on it, and the name was grief. And it had just been given new and terrible dimensions. "Who did it?" she said. "I have a strong idea." "Serena." He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Come and sit down," he said. "Dr. Yoon doesn't want you standing." "Dr. Yoon can—" She stopped herself, took a breath. "Fine." He told her what he knew over 2 cups of coffee in a small room adjacent to the clinic space, the kind of room that had a table and 4 chairs and nothing else, the kind of room designed for difficult conversations. Shin sat in the corner and said nothing. Zuri was still asleep. Taejun laid it out the way he laid everything out, without ornamentation, in sequence, with the particular precision of a man who had trained himself to present information cleanly even when the information was not clean. The 2 men from the building's security footage, whose identities Shin had spent the night establishing, contractors, not regulars, hired through a cutout company that traced back to a financial management firm used by Dr. Adrian Wolf's private practice. The anonymous footage of Evelyn at the copy machine sent to Shin's phone, the framing of it, the way it had been constructed to read as betrayal, as a secretary stealing proprietary family files. Evelyn listened to all of it without speaking. She held the coffee cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it against her palms and let the information settle. "She thought you'd fire me," she said when he finished. "She thought I'd do considerably more than fire you." The way he said it was without inflection, and the absence of inflection was the point. Evelyn looked at her coffee. "And the records. She wanted them back before you saw them. She needed the originals. The copies were secondary." He looked at the table. As long as the originals existed, there was always a version of events that matched what she'd constructed. Take those away, and there's nothing to reconstruct. "But she didn't know I'd annotated the copies." No. Evelyn thought about that, sitting at her kitchen table that afternoon, pencil in hand, marking the medication discrepancies with the focused attention of someone building an argument they might not be present to make. She had not thought of it as strategy at the time. She had thought of it as accuracy, old professional habit. "What does the letter say?" she said. "If you want to tell me." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother suspected at the end that her treatment had been altered. She couldn't prove it. She didn't have your training. But she had been a sharp woman her whole life, and she knew what her body was supposed to be doing and what it was doing instead." He paused. She'd been watching Serena for 2 years by that point. She saw things I didn't see. "What things?" "The way she managed information. what she chose to tell me and what she chose not to, the people she cultivated and why. He looked up. She told me in the letter that she had tried once to raise her concerns with me directly, that I had dismissed her. The room was very quiet. I was 31, he said. I thought she was being protective. Mothers are protective of their sons, I thought. I thought she didn't want me to marry anyone. Evelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say. She was trying to save my life, he said, and I told her she was worrying too much. His voice was level throughout. That was the most devastating thing about it. The absolute control, the refusal to let any of it break through in a way that could be seen. She understood this about him now in a way she hadn't before. The composure was not coldness. It was what he built over the things he couldn't afford to let out. Taijun. It was the first time she had used his name without the honorific, and they both noticed it, and neither of them addressed it. What are you going to do? What I should have done 3 years ago, he said. I'm going to take it apart. All of it. Every piece. How long? However long it takes to do it right. He looked at her. The wedding is in 11 days. She doesn't know yet that anything has changed. I need to keep it that way. Evelyn looked at him steadily. You want her to think the plan worked. I want her comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. She turned this over. She thought about Serena Vaughn. She had met her 4 times in 14 months. The particular category of beautiful that operated as a form of tactical communication, every element calibrated. She thought about the men in her apartment and the boot on her back and the question asked in a voice that carried no emotion at all. Where is it? She thought about Zuri on the floor beside her. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her for a moment. A look she couldn't entirely read. Something assessing and something else running underneath it. Your analysis of the records, everything you identified, I need it documented in your professional language, in a format that would hold up to scrutiny from another medical expert. I can do that. And your testimony, when the time comes. She thought about the licensing board, the 6 days, the way it felt to sit in a room full of people who had already decided, and to speak anyway, into the silence of their having already decided. My professional testimony, she said, from a nurse whose license was revoked. A nurse whose license was revoked as a direct result of a hospital cover-up that I am going to spend the next 11 days making very uncomfortable for the people who orchestrated it. He said it without heat, the way he said everything, the way a man stated a logistical fact. Your credibility is not the problem, I'll let it remain. She looked at him. You identified falsified medical records under adverse circumstances, he said. You secured the evidence at personal cost. You annotated it with professional precision while injured. A pause. I'm going to make sure the right people understand what that means. She didn't answer for a moment. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup, hands that had once been steadier than they were now, hands that had held IV lines and done wound assessments and filled in medication logs and had not, in 4 years of nothing work, entirely forgotten what they'd been built for. All right, she said. But she started that afternoon. Yoon gave her a workspace, a desk, a lamp, a legal pad, and the quiet understanding that she was not to be disturbed. Shin had retrieved the annotated copies from the storybook and placed them before her. She worked through them again from the start, this time writing rather than marking, building the clinical argument from the foundation up in the plain declarative language that medical documentation required. Observation, evidence, conclusion, corroborating detail. She had been at it for 2 hours when the door opened and it was Zuri, awake, shoes on, backpack inexplicably still on her shoulder. What are you doing? Zuri said. Working. On what? Something important. Zuri came and stood beside her and looked at the pages. Is it about Mommy's medicine stuff? Evelyn looked at her. Where did you hear about medicine stuff? You talk in your sleep. I do not. You do. Last night you said dosage discrepancy 3 times. Evelyn put her pen down and looked at her daughter. This small, impossible person with her backpack on, and her serious face, and her 6-year-old's perfect capacity for producing the exact sentence that dismantled whatever composure Evelyn had assembled. Come here, she said. Zuri came. Evelyn pulled her in with one arm, careful of the shoulder, and held her against her side and felt the solidity of her, the realness of her, the weight of her. "We're going to be okay," Evelyn said. "I know," Zuri said, with the equanimity of a person who had already reached that conclusion independently and was slightly surprised it needed stating. "How do you know?" "Because Mr. Kang came." She said it simply, factually, the way 6-year-olds stated things they considered self-evident. "When I told him you couldn't get up, he didn't ask any other questions. He just came." Evelyn held her tighter and looked at the papers on the desk and said nothing. On the 4th day, Shin brought news that changed the shape of everything. He came into the room where Tae-jun was working. Maps of corporate structure, financial records, a 4-year timeline of Serena's movements laid out on the table with the cold precision of an anatomy. And he put a photograph down and stepped back. Tae-jun looked at it. The photograph showed Dr. Adrian Wolf. Not at his practice, not at the hospital, not in any of the professional contexts in which Tae-jun had encountered him over the years, at charity events, at Serena's side. A careful background figure with careful background eyes. The photograph showed him at an airport. It was dated 3 days ago, the morning after the men had gone to Evelyn's apartment. The second photograph showed him at a different airport, arriving. "He didn't run," Shin said. "He came back." "Why?" "Because she called him back." Shin's voice was even. "We intercepted a call. Encrypted, but not encrypted enough." He put a phone on the table with a recording pulled up. 40 seconds. She's telling him the evidence was recovered, that the problem is handled, that he needs to come back and be visible because disappearing now would look like guilt, Tae-jun said. Yes. Tae-jun looked at the photographs. He thought about what this meant, about Serena's certainty, her confidence that the night in Mapogu had achieved what she'd sent it to achieve. She believed the copies were gone. She believed Evelyn had been discredited or worse. She believed the wedding was still the wedding. She had no idea. Where's Wolf now? The hospital, back on schedule, acting normal. Tae-jun picked up one of the photographs, looked at it, put it down. I want everything on him, not just the mother's case, everything, his practice, his finances, every patient he's lost that he shouldn't have lost. Serena doesn't operate alone. She needs instruments. He's the primary instrument. I want to know every way she owns him. That'll take 3 days. I have 7 left. He looked at Shin. Find me something that makes him want to talk. Shin left. Tae-jun stood at the table with the photographs and the timeline and his mother's letter, which he had taken out and placed at the center of it all as a kind of fixed point, a North Star for the geography of what had been done. He had built empires on the ability to see things clearly, to remove the emotional interference and work the problem. He was working the problem, but he was also a son. And the son part of him, which had been carefully and thoroughly suppressed for 3 years under the weight of running an empire and planning a wedding and not looking too directly at the things he couldn't change, that part was not asleep anymore. It had been awake since the moment he read the letter's last line, and it was running very hot underneath the cold. The call came on day 5 us, not from Shin, from a number he didn't recognize, routed through 3 different prefixes in the way that people routed calls, when they needed the first conversation to happen before either side had committed to the second one. He let it go to the secondary phone, the one that caught exactly this category of contact, and listened to the message. A man's voice, careful, educated. The particular precision of someone choosing every word with the awareness that words became evidence. I understand you have been making inquiries. I may have information relevant to a mutual concern. I would like to speak before certain arrangements move forward. I am asking for a conversation. That is all. Tae-jun played it twice. He knew the voice. He had heard it at dinner parties, at fundraisers, at the edge of conversations that Serena had steered him away from with the graceful deflection of a woman who managed access to information the way other people managed money. He knew the voice, and he knew what the call meant. Someone inside the architecture of what Serena had built had looked at the structure and seen it failing, and had decided that the time to choose sides was now, before the collapse, while there was still something to gain from choosing correctly. He called the number back. The man answered immediately. His name was Park Dong-hyun. He was the head of pharmaceutical procurement at the hospital where Kang Ye-rin had died. He had been in that position for 7 years. He had been placed in that position, he said, his voice very steady and very careful, by a recommendation from a board member who was a close personal associate of Serena Vaughan's, which he had not known at the time and which he had spent 4 years trying not to know afterward. "Tell me what you know," Tae-jun said. Park told him. It took 22 minutes. Tae-jun listened without interrupting, without writing anything down. He didn't need to. His memory for this category of information was architectural. It went in and stayed exactly where he put it. And when Park finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for Park to understand that the silence was not absence of response, but the presence of a decision being made in real time. "The pharmacy records," Tae-jun said finally. "The original dispensing logs for the weeks of my mother's final admission. They were supposed to be deleted. Were they?" A pause. "I made copies," Park said. 4 years ago. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I told myself I was keeping them for... I don't know what I told myself." A pause. "I still have them." Tae-jun exhaled through his nose, one long, controlled breath. "I'm going to send someone to you tonight. You will give them everything you have. In return, I will ensure that the distinction between the people who gave orders and the people who were given them is made absolutely clear to every relevant authority. And Serena will not be a concern for you after this week," Tae-jun said. "That I can promise." He hung up. He sat for a moment in the quiet and thought about the architecture of it, the full structure of what she had built, which was becoming visible to him now, the way a building became visible when the scaffolding came down, piece by piece, the real shape of it emerging. 7 years. She had been building this for 7 years. She had placed people, moved pieces, eliminated obstacles, maintained a surface of such perfect normality that he had looked directly at it for 3 years and seen nothing. He thought about his mother looking at the same surface and seeing through it. He thought about an envelope sealed and addressed and filed in a cabinet that nobody opened, waiting. He thought about Evelyn Brooks in a storage room at 2:17 p.m. making copies she had no reason to believe anyone would value, in an office whose owner she had every reason to fear, motivated by nothing except the trained compulsion to record what she saw accurately and the knowledge that accurate recording was the only form of protection that lasted. He picked up his phone and walked down the hall to the room where he knew she would be working and opened the door without knocking, which he had not done before. She looked up from the legal pad. Her face was still marked. The bruising along her jaw had moved through yellow-green. The laceration above her ear was held with 3 small strips of surgical tape, but her eyes were clear and the pen in her hand was steady, and the pages in front of her were dense with the precise clinical language she was building her case from. She looked at him and read something in his face. "What happened?" she said. "I have the pharmacy records," he said. "The originals, and a witness who was present for the order to falsify them." She put the pen down. She looked at him for a long moment. "Tae-jun," she said, "how long have you been sitting on this?" "I got the call 40 minutes ago. And before the call." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she stopped, looked at the papers in front of her, looked back up. "I mean, you've been building this case for 5 days, quietly, without telling Serena anything has changed, and you've been waiting." She tilted her head slightly. "What were you waiting for?" He was quiet for a moment. "I needed to be certain," he said. "Before I moved, I needed everything, not most of it, everything. And now you have everything, almost." He looked at her. "I need your documentation complete, in the next 48 hours. It'll be done in 24. She said it without hesitation, without bravado, just the flat statement of a woman assessing a task she knew she was capable of. She picked up her pen. "Close the door on your way out." He almost did. He had his hand on the door frame and was already half turned when she said, without looking up from the page, "The pharmacy records, do they show what I think they show?" "They show a directed substitution over the final 4 days," he said. "Ordered verbally, administered by one nurse who has since left the country, documented in a dispensing log that was supposed to disappear." Her pen stopped moving. She looked at the page for a moment. When she looked up, there was something in her face that was not the clinical distance she maintained. Something older, something that came from the part of her that had stood at bedsides at 3 in the morning and known what was coming and had to keep standing anyway. She suffered, Evelyn said. Not a question. Yes. The words sat in the room. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. He looked at her. He thought about saying something and decided that nothing he could say would be adequate, and that inadequate was worse than silence. And he went out and closed the door behind him. In the hallway, he stood for a moment with his back against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling and felt the full weight of it come through. The weight he had been holding at arm's length for 5 days with the discipline of a man who could not afford to set down what he was carrying until he had somewhere safe to put it. His mother. 11 days in a hospital. The letter she had written him. The son who had not listened. He stood there for 30 seconds. Then he pushed off the wall and went back to the table with the photographs and the timeline and began to plan the last move. 6 days left. The wedding that was never going to happen. And Serena Vaughn, in her apartment across the city, making seating arrangements for a ceremony that existed now only in the mind of a woman who did not yet know that the man she thought she controlled had been reading her blueprints for. The boardroom on the 41st floor of the Kang Group Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides and a table that seated 22 and had been designed, deliberately, to make everyone sitting at it aware of exactly how far off the ground they were. Tae-jun had chosen it for that reason when he'd had the building renovated 6 years ago. Height was a form of pressure. Pressure clarified thinking. He arrived at 7:45 a.m. The meeting was called for 9. He had not slept. He had not tried to sleep. He had spent the last 2 days in the particular compressed focus that preceded the kind of action he'd only taken a handful of times in his life, the kind where the margin for error was 0 and the cost of 0 was everything. And his body had simply stopped requesting sleep the way it stopped requesting food in the hours before something that required everything he had. Shin was already there, at the far end of the table, laptop open, a phone in each hand. He looked up when Tae-jun came in and gave a single nod that meant everything is in place. Tae-jun sat at the head of the table. He laid 3 folders in front of him. He aligned them precisely, edges flush with the table edge, the way he aligned everything when he needed the external world to reflect the internal order he was imposing on himself. He looked at the windows. The city below was just beginning to move, the early light hitting the Han River at an angle that made it look like hammered metal. He thought about his mother standing at a window like this one, years ago, pressing her hands flat on the glass, the way she pressed them flat on tables when she was being serious. He thought about her voice on the last phone call he'd had with her, 3 weeks before she was hospitalized. She had asked him how he was sleeping. He had said, fine. She had said, you never sleep well before something important. You never have. Not since you were small. He had not understood what she was telling him. He understood now. The invitations had gone out the previous afternoon, routed through the official Kang Group communication system with the authorization codes that only Tae-jun and 2 other senior executives carried. Board members, legal representatives, the 3 division heads whose signatures would be required for the post-wedding restructuring that Serena had spent 18 months quietly engineering. 21 people summoned for an emergency strategic review. The subject line: urgent pre-merger compliance and fiduciary matters. Neutral. Bureaucratic. The kind of meeting language that produced compliance without alarm. Serena received hers at 4 p.m. She called him at 4:12. He answered on the 3rd ring. He sat in the chair in the clinic room where Evelyn was working and listened to Serena's voice and felt the particular quality of performing a thing he had done 1,000 times. A conversation with a woman he knew, a woman who knew him, while being someone entirely different on the inside. And he found that it required less effort than it should have, which told him something about the nature of the previous 3 years that he filed away to think about later. A compliance meeting the week before the wedding, she said. Her voice was warm, lightly amused, the tone of a woman who was managing him gently. Tae-jun, the timing. The auditors flagged 3 items last week. It can't wait. Can it wait until after? No. He kept his voice neutral. I need everyone in the same room before the restructuring moves forward. It's due diligence. A pause, calibrated. You should be there. Given your role in the post-merger structure, it concerns you directly. A short silence. He could feel her thinking. the rapid lateral calculation of a woman who had survived as long as she had by reading subtext. He gave her nothing to read. He kept the line absolutely clean. "Of course," she said. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, he confirmed, and hung up. He looked at Evelyn, who was watching him from across the table with her pen suspended above the legal pad. "She'll come," he said. "She'll come prepared," Evelyn said. "I know." "She'll have a counter. She always has a counter." Evelyn set the pen down. "When she realizes what the meeting is actually for, she won't fall apart. She'll attack." "I know. She'll come after me specifically." Evelyn's voice was even. "My record. My license. She'll use everything available to discredit the medical documentation before it can be entered." He looked at her. "Can she?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The bruising on her jaw had faded to a dull yellow-green. The surgical tape above her ear was down to 2 strips. Her eyes were clear and steady and carried in them the particular quality that he had noticed in her from the first week she had worked for him and had registered as efficiency, and was understanding now to be something more durable than that. A quality of having already been broken by the worst thing and having rebuilt around it and being, as a result, unbreakable by anything less. "She can try," Evelyn said. Adrian Wolf arrived at the building at 8:40 a.m., escorted by 2 of Shin's people in the particular manner that was not arrest and was not invitation and existed in the territory between them where men like Wolf understood exactly what their options were. He was pale. He had the look of a man who had been sleeping badly for 4 years and had simply accepted it as the texture of his life and was now confronting the fact that bad sleep had merely been the preview. Shin put him in a room on the 39th floor with a glass of water and a copy of the pharmacy records, his own pharmacy records, the dispensing logs that Park Dong-hyun had kept for 4 years in a fireproof box in a storage unit in Yongsan, and left him alone with them for 15 minutes. When Shin came back, Wolf had aged 10 years. "She told me it was necessary," he said. His voice was the voice of a man talking to himself as much as to Shin, the specific dissociation of someone watching their own architecture collapse. "She said the woman was going to destroy everything. She said—" He stopped, pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. "She said it was the only way to protect what we'd built." "What you'd built," Shin said. Wolf looked up. Something passed through his eyes, the last flicker of the justification he'd been living inside, visible in the moment before it went out. "What she built," he said. He stopped again. "An instrument," Shin said. Wolf said nothing. At 9:15, Shin said, "You are going to walk into the boardroom on the 41st floor. You are going to sit down, and when you are asked a direct question, you are going to answer it with the same precision you brought to falsifying those records." He let that sit. "If you do that, the distinction between the person who gave orders and the person who executed them will be clearly established. If you don't—" He picked up the dispensing log and held it for a moment and set it back down. "The log already says everything. You're just deciding whether you're the man who came forward or the man who was dragged." Wolf looked at the log. He looked at the glass of water. He looked at the floor. "She won't forgive this," he said. "No," Shin agreed. "She won't." A pause. "Will it matter? Where she's going?" Shin said nothing. He didn't need to. They came in at 9, one by one, the board members and legal representatives and division heads, finding their seats with the particular wariness of people who had been given no information and were reading the room for it. Taejun was already seated. He had been seated for 20 minutes. He had the 3 folders in front of him, and his hands flat on the table and his face wearing the expression he'd refined over 15 years of rooms exactly like this one. A quality of absolute stillness that people consistently misread as calm, and which was not calm, but was something more dangerous than calm, which was certainty. Evelyn came in at 9:04. She was in the clothes Shin's assistant had brought her. Dark, clean, professional, the clothes of a woman who was about to speak in a room where her credibility was going to be the first thing attacked. Her shoulder was still bothering her. He could see it in the way she held herself slightly compensated, the right side fractionally higher. She took the seat he had placed for her to his left, which was the seat that communicated, This person is here by my authority. She put her documentation on the table in front of her. Legal pad, annotated copies, the 3-page typed summary she had completed at 2 a.m. the previous night. She did not look at him. She looked at the room, making a quiet assessment, the same look she had worn every day for 14 months in his office. Efficient, contained, already working. Serena arrived at 9:07. She came in wearing the particular kind of compose that was the product of considerable effort rather than actual composure. She was dressed with her usual precise elegance, everything correct, everything calibrated, and she swept the room in 3 seconds with those sharp green eyes and landed on Evelyn and held there for exactly 1 beat too long before she found her seat. She sat down across from Tae-jun. She looked at him and gave him the smile she had given him 1,000 times, warm and intimate, the smile of a woman who shared a private understanding with the most powerful person in the room. He looked back at her and gave her nothing. Something shifted in her eyes, almost imperceptible, but he'd been watching for it. He opened the first folder. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he said. His voice was even and carried without effort to every corner of the room. This meeting concerns 3 matters. The first is a set of irregularities in the pharmaceutical procurement records associated with Hyarin Medical Group's subsidiary accounts, dating back 4 years. He slid the first document, a summary, not the originals, not yet, to the center of the table. The second is a series of clinical documentation inconsistencies in the records of a patient admitted to Seoul Central Hospital in the 3rd quarter 3 years ago. He slid the second document. The third concerns the corporate restructuring proposal currently scheduled to execute contingent on a personal event occurring in 6 days. The room was silent with a quality of silence that had weight. Serena's hands were on the table, perfectly still. He noted this, the deliberate stillness, the choice to perform calm, and noted also the quality of her breathing, which had changed by a fraction she probably didn't know was visible. "Tae-jun," she said, and her voice was exactly right, warm and slightly concerned, the voice of a woman gently interrupting a man she loved before he did something unnecessary. "What is this?" "This is a compliance review," he said, as stated in the meeting notice. "These documents," she glanced at the summaries without touching them. "What patient are we discussing? What hospital records?" "My mother's," he said. The room shifted. 3 people exchanged glances. The lead legal representative, a man named O, who had worked for the Kang Group for 11 years, looked at the summary in front of him and then looked at Tae-jun with the careful attention of a man who understood that the conversation had just become something much more serious than a compliance review. Serena looked at the summary. Then she looked at Evelyn. The look lasted 3 seconds. It contained in concentrated form everything she was. The assessment, the calculation, the decision made in real time about the most efficient vector of attack. When she spoke, her voice had shed the warmth. Not all of it, but enough that the people in the room who were paying attention would hear the thing underneath it. "I see," she said, "and the source of these records." She looked at Evelyn with the particular smile of a woman who has been waiting for a door to open. A former nurse who had her license revoked for falsifying patient documentation. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds, and who has been residing for the past 5 days in accommodation provided by the man who employs her and is presiding over this meeting. She tilted her head. "I think we should discuss the integrity of this evidence before we go any further." The room reacted. Not dramatically, but the way rooms reacted to things that landed, small movements, people recalibrating, the lead attorney's pen stopping on his notepad. Evelyn did not move. Tae-jun looked at Serena. He said, "You're welcome to discuss it." Serena looked at Evelyn. "Your license was revoked in 2021 for falsifying patient medication records." She said it cleanly, without pleasure, which was more effective than pleasure would have been. "That is the professional history of the person who prepared this documentation." Evelyn picked up her pen. She looked at the table. Then she looked up. "My license was suspended pending investigation in 2021, she said, following a complaint filed by the board of Incheon General Hospital. The complaint alleged that I had falsified a medication log for a patient in cardiac care. Her voice was level, unhurried, The voice of a woman who had been waiting 4 years to say this in a room where it mattered. What the complaint did not include, because it was filed by the same board that had authorized the cover-up of a procurement error that contributed to 2 patient deaths that year, was the original log, the one I had flagged 3 weeks earlier, the one that showed the error before I was asked to redo it. She set her pen down. I kept a copy of that original log. I have kept it for 4 years. It will be submitted to this review alongside the documentation I prepared. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than before. Serena looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes. Not panic, she was too controlled for panic, but a rapid recalculation, the sensation of a floor that was supposed to be solid proving otherwise. That's a convenient piece of documentation to produce, Serena said. Yes, Evelyn said. It is, which is why I've had it notarized, dated, and cross-referenced against the hospital's own electronic records, which show the timestamp of the original entry and the timestamp of the revision. She looked at Serena steadily. I was a nurse for 7 years. I knew how to document things properly. I just didn't know, at 29, that the people I worked for were capable of what they were capable of. A pause. I've since updated my understanding. Taejun opened the second folder. In addition to the medical documentation, he said, I have a sworn statement from Park Dong-hyun, head of pharmaceutical procurement at Seoul Central Hospital, regarding the dispensing records for Kang Hye-rin's final admission. He slid copies down the table. Mr. Park will testify that the standard dispensing protocol was overridden during the final 4 days of her admission, that the override was communicated to him verbally by a member of the hospital's pharmaceutical committee, and that the committee member in question received his position through a board recommendation made by an associate of He looked at Serena. Yours. Serena's hands on the table did not move. Her face did not move. But something fundamental had changed in the quality of her stillness. It had gone from controlled to rigid, from chosen to enforced. Taejun. Her voice was very quiet now. Not warm. Not the performance. Just the voice underneath it, which was colder and more real, and which he was hearing for the first time. Think about what you're doing. I've thought about it for 5 days. You're destroying... I'm ending something that should have been ended the moment it started. He held her eyes. You killed my mother. You had her treatment altered over 4 days while I was running this company and planning a future with you, and she was writing me a letter warning me about exactly who you were. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. I dismissed her. That's on me. I'll carry that. But what you did, what you ordered, that's on you. Every piece of it. Serena stared at him. Then she did something he had not predicted, which was that she stood up. She stood up, and she looked around the room at the board members and the attorneys and the division heads, and she spoke with the absolute controlled clarity of a woman who had spent 7 years building something and was not going to let it dismantle without using every available weapon. This evidence was obtained illegally, she said, by a woman who broke into confidential medical archives, copied private family documents, and is now being presented as a credible witness by the man who has been sheltering her and her child in his private property for 5 days. She looked at the lead attorney. Nothing in these folders is admissible. Nothing. And any action taken on the basis of this meeting will be challenged in every available venue. She looked back at Taejun. You have one witness who's already compromised, and one disgraced former nurse whose documentation of your dead mother's records is the definition of a conflict of interest. That's what you have. The room was very still. Taejun looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the third folder. I also have a recording, he said. He set his phone on the table and pressed play. The voice that came out of the phone was Serena's. The call was 40 seconds long. It had been made 6 days ago, the morning after the men went to Mapogu, encrypted on her end through a service that had proven not quite encrypted enough. The content was specific. Confirmation that the evidence had been recovered, instruction to return and be visible, the particular careful language of a woman who believed she was speaking securely and was telling the truth about what she'd done. The recording ran to its end. The room was entirely without sound. Serena looked at the phone. She looked at Taejun. She looked at the room, at the faces of the board members who were looking at the table or the window or anything except her, the particular avoidance of people who have just understood something they can't unknow and are processing the implication of their own proximity to it. That recording, she said, and her voice had shed the last of the performance, stripped down to something bare and cold, was obtained without... The door opened. Two men came in. They were not Sheen's men. They wore suits and carried identification and moved with the particular economy of people authorized to be wherever they needed to be. Behind them, in the doorway, was a woman Tae-jun had met twice, a senior investigator from the Financial Crimes Investigation Division, who had been, for the past 18 hours, in possession of everything Shin had assembled. She looked at Serena Vaughn. Serena looked at her. And in that exchange, in the 3 seconds of it, the thing that passed between them, Evelyn watched from her seat to Tae-jun's left and saw the exact moment that 7 years of architecture understood it was over. Not the collapse itself. That would take time, lawyers and hearings, and the grinding machinery of consequence, but the understanding. The moment a person who has built everything on the certainty of winning encounters the specific geometry of having lost. Serena looked at Tae-jun one last time. Whatever she intended to say, she did not say it. Maybe there was nothing that fit. Maybe the woman who had spent 7 years having the precisely right words for every situation had finally arrived at the situation that had no right words. She looked at him for 2 seconds with something in her face that Evelyn could not read and suspected nobody in the room could read, and which Tae-jun received without expression, without movement, with the absolute stillness that was not peace and had never been peace. Then the investigators moved toward her and the room began to come apart around the edges. Voices, chairs, the controlled chaos of consequence arriving in full. And Evelyn looked down at her documentation on the table in front of her, 3 pages of clean clinical language representing 4 years of carrying something alone, and felt the particular sensation of a weight beginning, not finished, not gone, but beginning, to shift. Her pen was still in her hand. Her hands were steady. That was the first thing she noticed when the room finished coming apart around her. When the investigators moved and the voices rose and chairs scraped back from the table, and the boardroom became something other than a boardroom, something closer to the scene of an event that would be described in documents for years afterward. Through all of it, Evelyn Brooks sat with her pen in her hand and her 3 pages of documentation in front of her, and her hands were steady. She had not expected that. She had expected the shaking to come. The delayed physical reckoning that she knew from experience arrived after the crisis had passed, when the body finally sent the bill. But her hands were steady, and she sat with that steadiness and let herself feel the precise dimensions of it, which were not triumph and were not relief and were something she didn't have a clean word for, something that lived in the territory between those two things and was maybe just the sensation of having done the thing you set out to do. Around her, the room continued its controlled unraveling. Serena Vaughn was escorted from the boardroom with the particular precision of people who had done this before and understood that precision was a form of dignity that the situation no longer required them to offer, but that they offered anyway because they were professionals. She went without struggle. That was the thing Evelyn would remember later. Not the expression on her face, which she could not read, not the words she had or hadn't said, but the quality of her exit, which was the exit of a woman who had already, in the space of 30 seconds, shifted from one mode to another. The fighting was done. What came next was a different kind of war, the kind conducted in courtrooms and through attorneys, and Serena Vaughn was already preparing for that one as she walked out the door. Tae-jun did not watch her go. He sat at the head of the table with the 3 folders and his phone and his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the middle distance, and the boardroom emptied around him in stages, board members, division heads, the attorney. Stopping briefly to say something quietly in his ear that Tae-jun received with a single nod and nothing more. Shin moved through the room in the background, collecting, organizing the necessary machinery of aftermath. The investigators had taken the recording, the documentation copies, the pharmacy logs. They had left Evelyn's original legal pad, and the notarized file that had taken her 4 years to be in a position to produce. When the room was nearly empty, Tae-jun looked at her. She looked back. There was nothing adequate to say, and they both understood this, and so neither of them tried, which was its own form of communication, the kind that only existed between people who had been through something together that had no appropriate language yet. "Go be with Zuri," he said. She went. Zuri was in the clinic room where she had been all morning with Yoon's assistant and a set of colored pencils someone had found, working on the family project that was due. She had covered 3 pages with what appeared to be a highly detailed architectural rendering of their apartment in Mapogu, labeled in careful Korean characters that were mostly phonetically reasonable and grammatically inventive. When Evelyn came in, she looked up and assessed her mother with the swift diagnostic gaze that Evelyn recognized as her own reflected back. "Did it work?" Zuri said. Evelyn sat down in the chair beside her. Her shoulder ached, her ribs ached. The headache had settled into a dull, persistent pressure behind her left eye that she had learned to work around. She looked at her daughter's drawings, the apartment, small and detailed, the couch with the 2 tall chair at the kitchen table, the soup pot on the stove rendered in careful orange. "Yes," she said. "It worked." Zuri looked at the drawings. "Are we going home?" Evelyn thought about the apartment in Mapogu, the broken lock, the splintered door frame, the floor where she had lain and watched the room spin, and thought about soup burning and shoe violations and a FedEx envelope at the bottom of a tote bag. "Soon," she said. "We'll figure out the details." "Mr. Kang's house is very clean," Zuri said. "I noticed. He has a lot of rooms." A pause. "I think he lives alone." "Zuri, I'm just observing. Observe quieter." Zuri returned to her drawing with the expression of someone making a tactical retreat. After a moment, she said, without looking up, "Mommy, are you going to be okay?" Evelyn looked at her daughter. The top of her head bent over the paper, the careful movements of the pencil, the small hands that had picked up a phone on a destroyed kitchen floor and said 4 words into it with the steadiness of someone who had decided that falling apart was not an option. 6 years old. She had been 6 years old, and she had done that. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm going to be okay." Zuri nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already established. "Good," she said, and kept drawing. The weeks that followed were not clean. Nothing about consequence was ever clean, and Evelyn had been alive long enough and had watched enough institutional processes run their course to know that the distance between evidence and outcome was long and expensive and full of people whose job it was to complicate the obvious. Serena Vaughn retained 3 attorneys within 24 hours of her arrest. 2 of them were very good. One of them was extraordinary. The case that the Financial Crimes Investigation Division was building, conspiracy, financial fraud, the more serious charges related to Hye-rin's death, which required a separate investigation to formally reopen, was going to take time. And during that time, there would be motions and counter-motions and depositions, and the full weight of legal machinery grinding through the facts at the pace legal machinery ground. Evelyn knew this. She had watched institutional machinery before. She had learned to have a different relationship with time than she'd had at 29. When she had believed that truth moved quickly and justice was a direct line from evidence to outcome. It was not a direct line. It was a long road with bad weather and uncertain footing, and you walked it because the alternative was not walking it, and not walking it was not something she was built for. She gave her deposition on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the boardroom, in a conference room in a government building in Yeongdeung-po, with 2 investigators and a court reporter and her attorney, retained. She had been informed with the particular brevity that characterized everything Tae-jun did by the Kang Group's legal department as part of the formal review of her prior licensing case. She sat for 4 hours. She answered every question with the precision she had spent 3 weeks preparing, the clinical language exact and accessible, the timeline documented down to the minute. Halfway through, one of the investigators looked up from her notes and said, "Ms. Brooks, the original complaint filed against you in 2021. You've stated that the medication log submitted to the licensing board was altered. In your deposition, you've provided the original log with your timestamp on it." She looked down at the document. "Why didn't you submit this to the licensing board at the time?" Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. "I did," she said. "It was not accepted into evidence." A pause. "On what grounds?" "The board determined it could not be independently verified." She kept her voice level. "The hospital's electronic record system had been updated 6 weeks before my hearing. The update had overwritten the access logs that would have confirmed the original entry timestamp." She looked up. "It was a very thorough update." The investigator wrote something down. She did not look up when she said, "Do you believe that update was deliberate?" "I believe it happened 6 weeks before a hearing in which the timestamp would have been the primary evidence." Evelyn let that sit. "I'll let you draw your own conclusion." The investigator drew her conclusion. Evelyn saw it in the quality of the noting. The deposition lasted another hour and 40 minutes after that. When it ended, she sat in the hallway on a bench outside the conference room while her attorney did the necessary paperwork. And she was alone in the hallway for 7 minutes, and she sat with her hands in her lap and did nothing and thought nothing and just let the quiet be what it was. Her phone buzzed. A text from Zuri, sent from the tablet Shin's assistant had configured for her, which had 3 approved applications and a parental lock that Zuri had been philosophically opposed to since day one. Miss Park gave me an A on the family project. She said it was very detailed. Evelyn looked at this message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "I'll take you to get noodles." The response was immediate. "The place with the egg." "The place with the egg," she confirmed. She put the phone away and looked at the hallway ceiling and felt something move through her that was not a dramatic thing, not the kind of thing that announced itself. Just a small interior shift, the sensation of something that had been locked for 4 years beginning, slowly, with great difficulty and considerable pain, to open. The formal reopening of the investigation into Kang Hye-rin's death was announced in the 4th week. It was covered in the news with the particular intensity that attached itself to stories involving wealth and crime and family betrayal, and Tae-jun did not speak publicly about any of it, which was consistent with who he had always been, and which Evelyn respected in the way she respected all things that were consistent with themselves. She saw him twice in that period. Once in Shin's presence, in a meeting about the timeline of her licensing review, which was being handled through the medical board's formal reconsideration process now that new evidence had been submitted. Once alone, briefly, when she came to collect the last of Zuri's things from the clinic rooms they had occupied for nearly 2 weeks. The second time he was in the hallway outside the room, standing with his phone in his hand and his jacket off. The particular version of him that she had come to understand was the version between the armor being on and the armor being assembled. Something that existed in the margins of the public self, only visible from close range. He looked at the bag in her hand. "You're going back to Mapo-gu." "The lock has been replaced," she said. "Shin was thorough." "He is." He looked at the bag, then at her. "There are other options." "I know. If you wanted—" "I know," she said again. Not a shutdown, just the acknowledgement that the offer existed and had been received, and that she understood exactly what it was and what it wasn't, and that the difference mattered. "We need to go home, Tae-jun. Zuri needs her own space, her chair that's too tall, her soup pot." A pause. "I need to be a person who lives in her own apartment and goes to work and comes home. I need that to be real again." He was quiet for a moment. "Your position," he said. "The secretary role. If you want it back—" "I don't," she said. She watched something move through his face. Not surprised, not hurt, something more precise than either. "I was a nurse. I was a good nurse. I want to go back to being that." She looked at him. "But I want to thank you for believing the records before you had any other reason to." "You annotated them," he said, in pencil, every inconsistency marked, before you had any indication whether anyone would ever see them. He paused. "That's not something a person does unless they're committed to accuracy as a principle rather than a tactic." She looked at him. "Your mother's letter," she said. "In it, did she describe what she hoped for you?" "After." He was still for a moment. "She described what she wanted for me," he said, "which was not an empire and not a structure and not any of the things she'd watched me build." He looked at the wall. "She wanted me to find someone I was honest with." A pause. "She said she had never seen me be fully honest with anyone, that I always kept the last room locked." The hallway was quiet. Somewhere in the clinic, Zuri was carrying on a one-sided conversation with the tablet about the noodle place with the egg. "Were you honest with her?" Evelyn said. "With your mother?" "Not enough," he said. "Not as much as she deserved." He looked at her. "I was honest with you, in that boardroom. More than I planned to be." "I noticed," she said. He looked at the bag again. The small visible weight of the storybook inside it, the cartoon bear pressed against the canvas. "I'd like to see you," he said. After this is over, when it's settled. It won't be settled for a long time, she said. I know. Then ask me again, she said, when it's settled. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the particular nod that meant the negotiation was complete and the terms were accepted and he would honor them. She picked up the bag and went to get Zuri. The licensing board's formal reconsideration hearing was scheduled for a Monday in the 6th week. Evelyn did not sleep the night before. She lay in the repaired apartment, the door frame fixed, the lock replaced, the kitchen reorganized with the same precision she'd always brought to it, Zuri's storybook back on the nightstand, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the last time she'd been in a room full of people who had already decided. She thought about who she'd been walking into that room at 29, how much she'd believed in the process, how completely and expensively she'd learned what processes were actually made of. She was not 29 anymore. She got up at 5:30 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the documentation binder she'd assembled. Original log, notarized copy, timeline, the cross-reference hospital electronic records that the investigation had subpoenaed, and which showed, definitively, that the access log update preceding her hearing had been initiated from a terminal registered to a member of the hospital's legal affairs office. And she went through it one more time. Not because she didn't know it, because the preparation was the thing she had control over, and control was the thing she trusted. The hearing lasted 3 hours. 2 board members who had been present at the original decision had recused themselves, as the investigation's reach had extended to establish that both had received benefit from the same hospital board network that had filed the original complaint. The reconstituted panel was 5 people she had not seen before, which was the best she could have hoped for. She spoke for 40 minutes. She presented the documentation. She answered questions with the precision of someone who had spent 6 weeks anticipating exactly what would be asked and had answered each question in her own head enough times to have worn smooth the edges of anxiety around them. When she finished, the panel lead, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the look of someone who had seen the full range of what institutional processes could do to people who got in the way of money, looked at her over the documentation and said, "Ms. Brooks, the board is prepared to proceed to deliberation. Is there anything else you'd like to enter into the record?" Evelyn thought about this. She thought about what she could say, about 4 years, about Zuri's chair that was too tall, about a storage room with a flickering light and a misfiled folder and 12 minutes at a copy machine that had changed the shape of everything. She thought about what would be useful to say versus what would be satisfying to say versus what the record actually needed. "No," she said, "the documentation is complete." The deliberation took 47 minutes. When the panel lead came back in, she sat down and looked at Evelyn with the particular directness of someone who had decided something and was delivering it cleanly. "The board finds that the original suspension and subsequent revocation of your nursing license was based on materially compromised evidence and failed to meet the standard required for disciplinary action." She looked at the panel, then back. "The revocation is overturned. Your license is reinstated, effective immediately, with the full restoration of your professional standing and practice rights." Toshi Tarset. Evelyn sat with this. She sat with it for the time it took to feel its full dimensions. The 4 years of it, the weight of it, the specific cost of it in grocery store arithmetic and partial electric bills and Zuri's school uniform that she'd let out twice before buying new because new cost money she didn't have. She sat with all of that and let the overturning of it settle into the space those years had occupied, and she felt the weight shift, and she held it, held the shift, let it be real. Her eyes were dry. She had thought they might not be. But her eyes were dry and her hands were steady, and she nodded at the panel lead and said, "Thank you." Clean, no elaboration. She walked out into the hallway. Zuri was outside with Evelyn's attorney, sitting on the same kind of bench Evelyn had sat on in Yeongdeungpo, feet dangling, a juice box in her hand, watching the hallway with the specific vigilance of a child on lookout duty. When she saw Evelyn's face, she slid off the bench. Evelyn crouched down, careful of the shoulder, and Zuri came into her arms, and they stayed like that for a moment in the government hallway with the fluorescent lights and the linoleum floor and the particular smell of official buildings. And Evelyn held her daughter and felt the full solidity of her, the impossible realness of her, The weight of 6 years old with a juice box and a storybook, and the capacity to say 4 words into a phone that had unraveled 7 years of careful, lethal architecture. "Well?" Zuri said into her shoulder. "Well," Evelyn said, "did they give it back?" "They gave it back." Zuri was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can you wear the white coat again?" "Yes." "The one with your name on it." "I'll get a new one. With my name on it." Another moment. "Can I watch when you put it on the first time?" Evelyn pulled back and looked at her daughter's face and felt something that was enormous and quiet at the same time, the way really large things were quiet, because they had enough gravity to silence everything around them. "Yes," she said, "you can watch." Well, the clinic opened on a Thursday in the 3rd month. It was not a large building. It was a converted 2-story in Mapogu, the same district, 3 streets from the apartment, which Evelyn had considered and decided was intentional in a way she was comfortable with. It had been Kong Hye-han's last charitable project before her hospitalization, a proposal that had been stalled in permitting for 3 years, and Taejun had finished it. He had done this without announcement and without the kind of gesture that required acknowledgement. He had simply had it finished, equipped, staffed with 2 physicians and a social worker and a billing coordinator, and then he had called Evelyn and said, "They need a director." And she had said, "I know." The sign above the door said Haysall Community Health Clinic. Below it, in smaller letters, "Director, Evelyn Brooks, RN." She stood in front of it on the first morning before anyone arrived. The street was quiet. The building smelled of fresh paint and new equipment and the particular clean possibility of a space that hadn't been used yet. She stood with her coffee and her white coat and looked at her name on the sign. The coat was new. It was the right weight. She'd been specific about that. Heavier than the standard issue, the kind that moved with you rather than against you. Her name was on the left breast pocket in the same dark thread she'd had it done in the first time, 14 years ago, in a hospital corridor before her first shift. E. Brooks, RN. She had put it on that morning in the apartment bathroom mirror, and Zuri had been in the doorway exactly as promised, watching with the seriousness of someone witnessing something they'd been given specific responsibility to witness, and when Evelyn had smoothed the collar and turned around, Zuri had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "That's right. That's how you're supposed to look." She had not been able to answer that. She had just pulled her daughter in by the back of her neck and held on. Now she stood on the street in front of the sign with her coffee and let herself look at her own name for as long as it took to understand that it was real, that the name meant what it had once meant, that the 4 years between then and now had not subtracted from it but had, in the particular brutal arithmetic of things that cost you everything and leave you with more than you started with, added to it. She was not the same person who had walked into a licensing board hearing at 29. She was something that person had become after going through the thing that person had not survived intact, and the difference was not loss. The difference was weight, the useful kind. She heard a car behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She already knew, from the particular quality of the silence after the engine stopped, who it was. She had gotten very good at reading his silences. 14 months of professional attention had built that fluency, and 5 weeks of something other than professional had deepened it, and she had come to understand that she trusted it the way she trusted her clinical judgment, not because it was infallible, but because it was calibrated by experience and not by wish. She heard him come to stand beside her. She looked at the sign. He looked at the sign. The case against Serena Vaughn was in its 2nd month of pretrial proceedings. Park Dong-hyun had testified. Wolf had taken the agreement, and his testimony had been the primary instrument by which the conspiracy's timeline had been established in the prosecutor's formal submission. 3 additional hospital administrators had been identified as secondary participants. The restructuring that Serena had engineered, the 7-year plan that had run through a dead woman and a disgraced nurse and 47 days before a wedding, had been formally unwound by the Kong Group's legal department and reviewed by the relevant regulatory bodies. The empire it had been designed to seize was intact. Yeren's name was on the clinic. She wanted something like this, Taejun said, for years. She kept bringing it up at board meetings, and I kept telling her the margins didn't support a charitable expansion. He looked at the sign. She would have been very patient with me about being wrong. Was she often patient with you about being wrong? Constantly, he said. She had considerable practice. Evelyn looked at him. He was looking at the sign with an expression she had come to recognize as the face he wore when he was allowing himself to feel something without managing it, without the composure intervening. A rare thing, a face she had seen only a handful of times and which she understood was one of the things he was still learning to let out of the last locked room. He was not entirely there yet. He might not be for a long time. That was honest, and she valued honest above almost everything. "She was right about you," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "My mother. In the letter. She said she watched you keep everyone at arm's length." She looked at the clinic door. "She was right. But she was also right that it wasn't permanent." A pause. "She saw something she believed in." "She saw things I didn't see," he said. "She saw you before I did." In a manner of speaking, Evelyn thought about this, about a woman she had never met, writing a letter in the last days of her life for a son who would need years and a destroyed apartment and 4 words from a 6-year-old before he found his way to opening it. She thought about the particular kind of faith that required to write a letter to a future you couldn't control, to seal it, to trust it to the cabinet and the flickering light and the ordinary day when someone ran out of storage space and reached for the bottom shelf. She thought about Zuri with the phone pressed to her ear, chain of events, the specific unplannable chain of them, the one that ran from a misfiled folder to a copy machine to a burned soup pot to a child's voice to a boardroom to a sign with her name on it. Nobody had designed it. Nobody could have. It had happened the way real things happened, which was sideways and at cost, and without the architecture of intention behind it, just the accumulated weight of people doing the thing they were built to do under the circumstances they were given. The first patient arrived at 8:55. A woman in her 40s with a child in her arms and the particular expression of someone who had been holding a problem alone for longer than the problem should have been held alone. Evelyn looked at her. She set her coffee down on the low wall beside the door. She felt the white coat settle around her, the weight of it, the right weight, the weight of 14 years and 4 years and everything in between pressed into the fabric of it. "I'll be right with you," she said. She turned back to Tae-jun. He looked at her. Something in his face that was quiet and real and did not require management. "Go," he said. She went. The door closed behind her with the particular sound of a thing beginning, not the beginning that announced itself, not the kind with music and resolution, but the plain functional beginning of a Tuesday morning in a converted 2-story in Mapo-gu, a director in a white coat with her name on it meeting the first person who needed her. Tae-jun stood on the street and looked at the door for a moment. Then he looked at the sign, E. Brooks, R.N. He stood with his hands in his pockets and the morning light on the street and the sound of the city doing what cities did, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware of what had happened in the rooms and hallways and destroyed apartments and boardrooms that had produced this particular morning on this particular street. He thought about his mother's hands on a table. Pay attention. This is the real thing. He had paid attention. He stood there until he was ready to move, and then he moved, and the street took him in the way streets took everyone. And behind him the clinic door was closed, and on the other side of it, Evelyn Brooks was already working, already exactly where she was supposed to be, in the white coat with her name on it, in the life she had earned back from the people who had tried to take it, doing the things she had been built to do. The sign above the door caught the morning light. Haysall Community Health Clinic. Director, Evelyn Brooks, R.N. 4 words that were not mommy, can't get up, but that had begun, in the particular way that endings made beginnings possible, with exactly those 4 words. With a 6-year-old on a destroyed kitchen floor. With the only phone call that had ever mattered.